Don't drink the wine because it is poisoned.
The warning was a ghost of a sound, a tiny vibration against the roar of the gala that only a man who slept with one eye open could have felt. Don't drink it. The mean man put a sleepy poison in there. Ji-hoon, the Iron Dragon, Kang's hand stopped dead, the heavy crystal tumbler millimeters from his lips. His cold, piercing gaze shifted downward to find a 5-year-old girl standing at his elbow. Her puff of curly hair and simple pink bow looked like a single spark of light against the winter-black severity of his bespoke suit. Her soulful eyes held a terrifying clarity, an urgent wisdom that should have been impossible for a child her age. The fact that she was there at all, standing within arm's reach of the city's most feared predator, without his elite security detail intercepting her, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Ji-hoon's veins. Please like and subscribe as I continue this unique story. IT tells that you are part of the amazing growth of this channel. Around them, the gilded ballroom of the Grand Seoul Hotel breathed with the scent of expensive cologne and the clink of silver on fine china. 500 of the city's elite sat beneath massive crystal chandeliers that cast sharp, prismatic shadows across the polished floor. Ji-hoon had been moments away from closing a deal that would consolidate his grip on the underworld when this small, fragile interruption materialized. His guards stood 15 feet away, statues in black, somehow completely blind to the child who had slipped through their perimeter like a shadow. Near the ice sculpture, a string quintet played a haunting Korean folk melody. Outside, the city lights blurred through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Amara had been sitting on a low stool near the kitchen entrance, tucked behind a heavy velvet curtain, watching the world through the unseen gaps. She noticed the small things, the way a server's hand shook, or how one man at the corner table didn't eat, only watched. Her eyes had locked onto a rival lieutenant, a man her mind labeled the mean one because of his sharp, jagged movements. She had seen him lean over the table while the sad man was looking away. She saw the tiny glass vial hidden in his palm and the colorless liquid that vanished into the drink. While the adults were blinded by power and ego, Amara's innocence allowed her to see the truth. The fear had made her small hands squeeze her teddy bear, but her feet moved before she could be afraid. She didn't see a mafia boss. She saw a mistake about to happen, and she was the only one close enough to stop it. The Grand Seoul Hotel's ballroom was a cathedral of glass and ego, a place where the air itself felt heavy with the price of the perfume and the weight of the secrets exchanged in the shadows. At the center of this gilded cage sat Ji-hoon, the Iron Dragon Kong. He was a man carved from granite and shadow, dressed in a bespoke black suit that seemed to absorb the light of the overhead chandeliers. He didn't lean back in his chair. He sat with a predatory stillness, his slightly open collar revealing the jagged edge of a tattoo that whispered of a violence most people in the room only saw in movies. To the governors, CEOs, and rival syndicate heads circulating through the gala, Ji-hoon was more than a man. He was a natural disaster held in check by a silk tie. When he spoke, conversations in a 10-foot radius died a sudden, respectful death. When he looked at a person, they didn't see a host, they saw a judge. He was the Iron Dragon, because he had survived 3 decades in a world of shifting allegiances by trusting no one and observing everything. His eyes, cold and piercing, scanned the room with a hyper-observant efficiency, noting the nervous sweat on a rival's brow and the slight bulge of a concealed weapon under a waiter's jacket. The gala was his stage, a carefully choreographed display of dominance meant to finalize a merger that would put the city's docks under his absolute control. Around him, the orchestra's violins soared, competing with the clatter of silver against porcelain. Trays of vintage champagne and delicate canapes moved through the crowd, carried by servers who kept their heads low, terrified of making eye contact with the man at the head table. Ji-hoon lived by a singular, ruthless code. Coincidences were myths, and kindness was a weakness used by enemies to get close. He had built a fortress around his life, guarded by men trained to kill and reinforced by a heart that had long since frozen over. He was a man who expected a bullet from the balcony or a blade in the dark, but he was entirely unprepared for the small, warm tug on his sleeve. In this den of lions, where every hand offered was a potential trap, he never imagined that the only honest soul in the room was a 5-year-old girl with a pink bow and a secret that would save his life. While the giants of the underworld clashed over wine and whispers, Amara existed in the world of the knees and the hemline. To a 5-year-old, the ballroom wasn't a seat of power, it was a forest of moving pillars. She was tucked away in a narrow gap between a heavy velvet pillar wrap and a serving station, a secret pocket of space her mother had told her to stay in until the big lights go out. Her mother, Bailey, was a blur of white apron and frantic motion, weaving through the tables with a silver tray held high, her face a mask of professional invisibility. Amara didn't mind the wait. She had her sketchbook, but she found the people far more interesting to draw. From her low vantage point, she saw the things the adults were too tall to notice. She saw the way a woman in a shimmering gold dress kicked off her painful shoes under the table when no one was looking. She saw the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the security guard's boots, and the way one man near the back kept checking a watch that didn't seem to be ticking. To Amara, the world was a series of patterns, and she was an expert at spotting when a pattern broke. Her bright, soulful eyes settled on the man at the center table, the one everyone else seemed to be afraid of. To the rest of the room, he was the Iron Dragon, a figure of terror. But to Amara, who hadn't yet learned the vocabulary of fear, he just looked lonely. He sat so still, surrounded by hundreds of people, yet he looked like he was on an island by himself. She watched the way he held his glass, his fingers long and steady, and she found herself wanting to draw the sad man, with the dragon hidden under his shirt. The air in the ballroom felt different tonight, sharper, like the smell of the air right before a thunderstorm. Amara's knack was humming in the back of her mind, a quiet restlessness that made her toes wiggle in her patent leather shoes. She watched her mother pass by, seeing the sheen of sweat on Bailey's forehead and the way her hands trembled slightly under the weight of the tray. Amara knew her mom was working hard so they could have the big apartment one day, and that made Amara want to be a good helper. She went back to her vantage point, her puff of curly hair pressing against the velvet curtain, her gaze drifting back to the head table. She didn't know about syndicates, shipping contracts, or assassinations. She only knew that the patterns were shifting. The shadows around the head table were moving in a way they weren't supposed to, and a man with a mean face was closing in on the sad man's island. The shift in the pattern happened with the silent precision of a ticking clock. From her sanctuary behind the velvet curtain, Amara watched a man with sharp, fox-like eyes drift toward the head table. He wasn't like the other guests who approached the Iron Dragon with bowed heads and trembling voices. This man moved with a forced casualness, a predator trying to look like a breeze. Ji-hoon was momentarily distracted, his head turned as an international investor leaned in to whisper a final term for the shipping contract. It was a window of only 3 seconds, the kind of opening a professional spends a lifetime looking for. Amara's breath hitched in her small chest. She saw the fox-eyed man's hand hover over Ji-hoon's crystal tumbler. His fingers flicked with a practiced, oily grace, and a tiny glass vial emerged from his palm like a magician's trick. A single drop of clear liquid fell into the amber spirit. It didn't splash. It vanished, a silent ripple that disappeared into the drink as if it had never been there. The man tucked the vial back into his sleeve and stepped away, his face remaining a mask of bored indifference. To the 500 adults in the room, nothing had changed. The violins continued their elegant weep, the champagne continued to flow, and the power brokers continued to lie. But to Amara, the air had turned cold. She knew what poison was. She had seen the skull and crossbones labels on the cleaning bottles her mother kept on the high shelves at home. She knew that clear things could be ouchy things. Her heart began to drum against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the ticking of the clock on the far wall. She looked for her mother, but Bailey was at the far end of the ballroom, lost in a sea of silver trays and white linens. There was no one to tell. She looked back at the head table. This sad man was reaching for the glass. His long, steady fingers were closing around the crystal, lifting the death trap toward his lips with a calm that made Amara's stomach do a nervous flip. She realized then that the patterns wouldn't fix themselves. If the fox-eyed man succeeded, the sad man wouldn't just be lonely anymore. He would be gone. The innocence that usually kept her quiet vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity. She didn't think about the guards, the Iron Dragon, or the rules her mother had given her. She only saw the glass moving higher and the life that was about to be snuffed out. Amara stepped out from behind the velvet curtain, her pink bow bobbing as she began to run. Amara moved like a breath of air through a forest of steel. To the security detail guarding the inner sanctum of the head table, the world was a grid of potential threats, reaching hands, shifting eyes, and bulky waistbands. They were trained to spot the hardened assassin, the desperate debtor, or the rival soldier. None of them were looking for a 30-pound child in a pink dress navigating the blind spots of their peripheral vision. She ducked beneath the sweep of a guard's arm just as he turned to scan the balcony. She was a flash of color against the dark floor, weaving between the heavy chairs and the long, flowing tablecloths that served as silk tunnels for her escape. The closer she got, the more the atmosphere changed. The air near Ji-hoon didn't just feel cold. It felt electrified, a zone of absolute authority where the usual rules of the gala didn't apply. 10 feet away, a massive man with a scarred temple and an earpiece stepped into her path. He was a mountain of black wool, his hand resting near the holster concealed by his jacket. This was the dragon's most trusted shield, a man who hadn't let a stranger within breathing distance of Ji-hoon for a decade. Amara didn't stop. She didn't have the adult sense of self-preservation that would have frozen her in place. Instead, she timed her movement to the rhythm of a passing server, using the distraction of a falling napkin to slide behind the giant's heel. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Every step felt like a gamble against a storm. Ji-hoon was lifting the glass now, the amber liquid swirling against the crystal rim, catching the light of the chandeliers. He was a second away from the point of no return. She reached the edge of the table, her small hand extending toward the expensive fabric of his sleeve. The guards finally noticed the breach, a ripple of movement in the restricted zone. Hands moved toward weapons, bodies tensed to lunge. The Iron Dragon himself felt the shift in the room's energy, his eyes narrowing as he sensed an intruder in his personal space. But before the security detail could descend, before the violence could erupt, a tiny, warm hand clamped onto Ji-hoon's silk-covered forearm. The contrast was a physical shock, the smallest person in the room holding the most powerful man still. The ballroom seemed to fall into a vacuum of silence as the Iron Dragon looked down into the soulful, urgent eyes of a child who had done the impossible. The world stopped. Ji-hoon's hand, a limb that had never wavered under the threat of gunfire, froze in midair. The amber liquid in the glass shivered, a tiny storm trapped in crystal. He could feel his guards closing in, a dark tide of suits ready to neutralize the breach. But he raised his free hand in a sharp, infinitesimal gesture that halted them in their tracks. The silence that followed was heavy, a vacuum that sucked the music and laughter out of the ballroom. Ji-hoon looked down. He saw a puff of curly hair and a pink bow that looked absurdly bright against the grim reality of his world. Then, he looked into her eyes. They weren't the eyes of an assassin or a beggar. They were clear, wide pools of absolute sincerity. Amara leaned in, her small hand still clutching his sleeve, and her voice arrived as a soft, urgent breath that barely carried over the rim of the table. "Don't drink it." The mean man put a sleepy poison in there. Ji-hoon did not blink. His mind, a high-speed processor built for survival, immediately began to scan the room. He didn't ask her how she knew or who she was. He simply accepted the data as a variable he had missed. His gaze swept the perimeter until it snagged on the fox-eyed lieutenant who was suddenly, far too intently, engaged in a conversation across the room. The man's posture was a fraction too stiff, his exit route already mapped out by the way his toes pointed toward the heavy oak doors. The reaction of the Iron Dragon was not a shout or a sudden movement. It was a terrifying, glacial shift in his aura. His cold eyes darkened, turning into chips of obsidian. He slowly lowered the glass, placing it back on the white linen with a deliberate, haunting click. The sound was like a gavel bringing a death sentence to order. He didn't look at his guards. He didn't look at his business partners. He kept his focus on the little girl, his hyper-observant mind noting the way she didn't flinch from him. For the first time in his life, Ji-hoon was looking at someone who wanted nothing from him but his life. He saw the mean man she had described, and he saw this sleepy poison for what it truly was, a coward's coup. The ruthless efficiency that made him feared began to hum beneath his skin, but as he looked at Amara, the ice in his chest cracked. He wasn't just a boss being targeted. He was a man who had been saved by a spark of light. Ji-hoon did not move with haste. He moved with the terrifying precision of a machine. Without taking his eyes off the fox-eyed lieutenant, he reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a silk handkerchief. He dipped the corner of the fabric into the amber liquid of his glass, then held it out toward his head of security, Marcus. In the underworld, the dragon's silence was more expressive than any shout. Marcus understood. He pulled a small, portable ultraviolet light from his belt, a tool of the trade in an era of chemical warfare, and clicked it on beneath the table's edge. The liquid on the silk glowed a sickly, neon violet. The confirmation was a spark in a powder keg. Ji-hoon's gaze didn't just harden, it became lethal. He looked at the fox-eyed man, who was now halfway to the exit, and inclined his head by a single degree. It was a silent go order. Suddenly, the elegant gala fractured. The statues in black, who had been standing at the perimeter, transformed into a coordinated strike team. The music didn't stop, but the rhythm of the room shattered as Ji-hoon's men moved with predatory speed. The fox-eyed traitor realized the game was up. He didn't flee. He reached into his jacket, and the sound of a chair screeching against the marble floor rang out like a gunshot. "Secure the girl," Ji-hoon commanded, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. The ballroom erupted. Guests screamed and dove for cover beneath tables as the first silenced shots hissed through the air, shattering the ice sculpture and sending a spray of crystal shards across the floor. The fox-eyed man's associates, hidden among the servers and the elite, drew their weapons. The gala was no longer a party. It was a tactical kill zone. Amidst the chaos, Ji-hoon stood up, his tall frame a pillar of shadow in the center of the storm. He didn't reach for his own weapon, not yet. Instead, he stepped in front of Amara, his broad shoulders creating a human fortress between her and the crossfire. He looked down at her, seeing her small hands over her ears, her eyes wide with the sudden, violent transition of her world. The traitors were being systematically hunted down, the iron dragons, wrath manifesting in the swift, muffled thuds of bodies hitting the marble. But Ji-hoon's focus was split. For the first time in his career, he wasn't just thinking about the elimination of his enemies. He was calculating the trajectory of every stray bullet, ensuring that none of them could reach the child who had broken the silence of his isolation. The ballroom smelled of ozone and expensive wine, a cocktail of death, but the dragon remained rooted to the spot, a shield of black silk and iron will. The velvet silence of the gala had been replaced by the rhythmic, muffled thuds of suppressed gunfire and the panicked orchestration of breaking glass. Smoke from the tactical canisters began to coil around the crystal chandeliers like a gray funeral shroud. For Ji-hoon, the exit was a straight line, a clear path through the service doors that his men had already secured. Every instinct honed over decades of survival screamed at him to take it, to disappear into the night and let his soldiers burn the room to the ground. Instead, he turned his back on the exit. He looked down at the small girl huddled at his feet. Amara was trembling, her pink bow lopsided, her small hands clutching the hem of his trousers. In the logic of the underworld, she was a liability, a piece of collateral that slowed him down. But as a stray bullet chipped the marble pillar inches above his head, showering them in white dust, Ji-hoon didn't see a witness or a server's daughter. He saw the only creature in the city who had looked at the Iron Dragon and seen a man worth saving. "Close your eyes, little one," he murmured, his voice surprisingly steady amidst the cacophony. He didn't wait for her to obey. With a fluid, powerful motion, Ji-hoon scooped Amara up, tucking her small frame against his chest. He used his own body as a living barricade, shielding her with the reinforced silk of his jacket and the literal iron of his resolve. A rival gunman emerged from behind the overturned dessert table, leveling a weapon. Ji-hoon didn't flinch. He didn't drop the girl to reach for his own gun. He simply pivoted, putting his shoulder to the threat as Marcus neutralized the shooter with a clinical burst of fire. The debt of honor was no longer an abstract concept. It was a physical weight in his arms. He felt her heart racing against his ribs, a frantic, tiny bird trapped in a cage of ribs. He navigated the chaos not with the speed of a man fleeing, but with the deliberate, heavy pace of a guardian. He bypassed his armored car, realizing it was too visible a target, and instead veered toward the kitchen corridors where the staff were huddled in terror. His men formed a moving perimeter around him, a phalanx of black suits protecting their king, and the child he held like a king's ransom. As they reached the relative safety of the rear service hall, Ji-hoon felt a warm dampness on his shoulder. Amara wasn't crying. She was simply breathing, her face pressed into the crook of his neck. He had risked his empire and his life for a server's child, breaking every rule of the Dragon's Code. But as he felt the small, trusting grip of her hand on his collar, he knew the debt wasn't just being paid. It was being rewritten. The roar of the gun battle faded into a haunting hum as the heavy steel doors of the service corridor swung shut, sealing out the carnage. The air here was different, scented with industrial soap and the lingering aroma of cooling appetizers, a stark contrast to the ozone and iron of the ballroom. Ji-hoon did not set Amara down immediately. He stood in the dim light of the hallway, his chest heaving slightly, feeling the unfamiliar warmth of the small girl against his cold exterior. Amara. Oh God, Amara. The scream was raw, fueled by a mother's primal terror. Bailey stumbled out from a cluster of panicked staff members, her white apron stained with spilled wine and dust. She skidded to a halt a few feet away, her eyes darting from her daughter to the blood spatter on Ji-hoon's lapel. She knew who he was. Everyone who worked the city's high-end circuit knew the Iron Dragon was a man you didn't look at, let alone touch. To see him holding her child was a sight that momentarily froze the breath in her lungs. Ji-hoon knelt, his movements stiff, and gently lowered Amara to the floor. The girl immediately sprinted into her mother's arms, burying her face in the apron. Bailey collapsed to her knees, sobbing as she checked Amara's arms and legs for wounds. "I'm okay, Mommy," Amara whispered, her voice muffled but steady. "The sad man kept me safe." Ji-hoon stood slowly, looming over them like a dark monument. Marcus and the rest of his security detail stood at a distance, their weapons lowered but their eyes scanning the exits. They were waiting for the command to leave, to vanish before the authorities arrived. But Ji-hoon remained rooted. He watched the way Bailey clung to her daughter, not out of a desire for power or a need for a favor, but out of a love so fierce it seemed to vibrate in the narrow hall. He looked at Amara, who was peeking at him from behind her mother's shoulder. She wasn't looking at him with the calculated respect of a business partner or the cowering fear of an enemy. She looked at him with the same soulful clarity she'd had at the table. She had saved him simply because she saw a sad man about to make a mistake. There was no agenda, no price tag, no hidden vial of poison in her words. It was a purity of intent that Ji-hoon hadn't encountered in 30 years. For a man who had built his life on the belief that everyone had a price, the realization was a seismic shift. The Iron Dragon had been saved by a spark of innocence that he had long ago decided didn't exist. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy, gold-embossed card, not a business card, but a personal seal. He didn't hand it to Bailey. He handed it to Amara. "This is for the girl who sees what others miss," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "If you ever see a mean man again, or if the world becomes too loud, you show this to anyone in a black suit. They will answer to me." 6 months later, the scent of the Grand Seoul Hotel's ozone and gunpowder had been replaced by the salt-kissed breeze of the coast. In a quiet, sun-drenched neighborhood far from the jagged skyline of the city's underworld, a small house stood with a garden full of blooming peonies and a porch that caught the morning light. There were no velvet curtains here, no hidden vials, and no men with mean faces lurking in the shadows. Bailey moved through the kitchen of her own bakery. The white apron she wore now a symbol of her own business rather than her invisibility. She looked out the window, watching Amara chase a golden retriever across the grass. The girl's puff of curly hair was still decorated with a pink bow, but her eyes, once filled with the urgency of a life-or-death secret, now sparkled with the simple joy of being a child. They were safe, not by luck, but by the decree of a man the world still whispered about in shadows. A block away, a sleek black sedan sat idling under the shade of an old oak tree. Inside, the air was cool and silent. Jahoon, the Iron Dragon, Kong sat in the back seat, his bespoke suit as dark and sharp as ever, but his collar was closed now, the dragon tattoo hidden once more. He didn't have a glass of amber liquid in his hand. Instead, he held a small, colorful drawing Amara had sent to his office weeks ago. It was a crude but unmistakable sketch of a man with a dragon, no longer looking sad, standing under a very bright sun. His empire was still vast, and his enemies were still many, but the way he ruled had changed. He was no longer just a predator guarding a hoard of gold. He had become a ghost, a silent guardian who ensured that the bakery's bills were always paid and that the neighborhood remained the safest square mile in the country. His security detail didn't just scan for assassins anymore. They vetted the delivery drivers and the neighbors, creating an invisible fortress around the girl who had saved his soul with a whisper. Jihoon watched through the tinted glass as Amara tripped, laughed, and scrambled back to her feet. He didn't need her to see him. He didn't need a thank you. The debt of honor was a weight he would happily carry for the rest of his life. He had spent 40 years believing that power was found in the ability to take life, only to learn from a 5-year-old that the greatest power was the will to protect it. As the car pulled away, disappearing into the suburban quiet, the Iron Dragon felt a strange, quiet peace. The city still belonged to him, but his heart belonged to the small house with the pink bows. He was no longer just a boss sitting on a throne of ice. He was a protector, watching over the light he had almost lost, ensuring that for Amara, the patterns of the world would always remain beautiful.